So I would turn to Professor Kahanman, and I would like to ask you, after what you have just told us, that decision-making is basically gambling, and that we shouldn't judge leaders and politicians on outcome, rather judge them on the procedures and decision-making. Our system, the democratic system, the Western system, the 21st century system is about outcomes, very short, very fast. So what do you suggest for the people, for the voters? How can they judge, how can they choose the leaders that should lead them when they have no possibility to do it on the process? They only look and hear outcomes, usually in 140, bytes of a tweet.
It's very difficult to give advice to the voters because it's also a rather futile activity to give advice to the voters. This is in part a problem for the educational system, really, because you have to begin with the educational system, because if you trust the political system to straighten itself out, it's not going to work. But it is possible, I think, and it should be a duty of the educational system to train future voters to think of process, to think of the quality of decision-making, to think of the role of values in leadership. All of this has to start early, because if you wait for the political system to do it, it's going to be too late.
And if you look at society today, do you think we're in the right direction, or on the contrary, we are in a society that is almost addicted to outcome, short, fast feedbacks?
Well, this is clearly, in many domains of life, it is getting worse.
I want simply to support what you said and you said. I was running different organizations, and generally I have the staff around me. The choices between looking for people who are loyal or looking for people who are independent and extremely able. If they're able, they are not loyal. They have their own ideas. If they are loyal, they don't think too much. I think if I have had success, it's because the people that were working with me, because they didn't agree with what I'm doing, because they have their own ideas, and because I learned from them more than I have initiated myself.
I think that really goes back to a point I was making at the very end on the ability of leaders to select, I call that coaches, of selecting people who will actually tell them objectively how well they are doing and who will not be afraid of telling them that.
Professor Sandel, I want to continue from that point, because what you describe basically is a society that in a way is accepting, I'm going to be very blunt, a rat style of life. I mean, and always looking for an incentive, agreeing for this reality that you have portrayed. Now, in the last summer, we had an uprising, a social uprising. I think in the essence, they said we want social justice. We don't want it to be just about economy and about market. We want to think about ethics. Why do you think that is still a small part and major part of society goes along with this rat-style incentive way of life?
I think for a couple of reasons. One is that in recent decades, economics has crowded out politics, has crowded out democratic politics. And so our public discourse is largely given over to managerial and technocratic discussion, on the one hand, which inspires no one, or where passion enters, it often comes in the form of narrow, intolerant fundamentalisms. And I think the reason for that is that there is a kind of moral vacuum in the public life of most democracies. There is very little public debate about big ethical questions, or questions of social justice, or about the role of markets. We shy away from that, partly because it's very difficult we fear the disagreement that will inevitably accompany a morally engaged kind of public discourse. And so we take refuge, we fall back on managerial, technocratic, or economistic ways of discussing politics. But where that leaves us is with a very widespread and a deepening frustration and discontent in many democracies with the established political parties and with the terms of public discourse.
But if I may, at some point in 2008, there was a feeling that maybe it will be corrected, that this catastrophe could be used as an advantage.
Yeah.
It seemed to have slipped away. Do you agree?
Yes, I think the most striking fact about the aftermath of the financial crisis is how little it changed with respect to our public debates. I think almost everyone assumed in 2008 that the era of unquestioned market faith had come to an end, that markets had somehow become detached from morals and ethics, and that now would be a time of reconsideration, of stepping back, of having a serious public debate about the proper relation between markets and morals. And yet that didn't happen. We had some debates about regulation, but that was about it. And we've fallen back, and our public discourse has really been very little affected by that experience, and I think that's a great loss. And we need to ask why.
I'm just wondering how much this is economics and how much this is politics. Because what happened in 2008 in the United States was that the political debate didn't change. The sense of national unity didn't increase. It was not perceived as a common threat. And I was wondering, as you spoke, how much of a role do common threats play in enhancing the sense of solidarity and the appeal of values in countries? And to some extent, what has happened that our societies have become so polarized?
Yeah. Did you want me to respond? Yeah. I think it's a great question. I think common threats do generate social solidarity, which may partly explain why there is a deficit of solidarity in the United States, and there is a stronger sense of social solidarity in Israel. It may have largely to do with threat. And yet, the financial crisis did pose a threat. It posed a threat, the risk that the entire economy would melt down. But I think in the face of that threat, instead of responding with a morally invigorated public debate about too big to fail, about the role of banks and financial institutions and their democratic accountability, instead of that, in the face of the threat, there was a kind of political timidity, almost a sense of intimidation, that we have to just patch it up in a minimal way to get over this immediate threat. And that left public discourse empty and impoverished.
And I would pick on from there, maybe it's just a suggestion and a thought, maybe it's also because in a way we are a generation which is so used to instant solutions and junk food in a whole, which brings me to Dr. Agus, and I wanted to ask you, why is it in a field of health where, it seems to be that, you know that if you make the right choice, you will benefit from it. It's really A to B, very clearly, and still it is the field where we slip back to our mistakes again and again. A smoker knows for sure that if he takes the next cigarette, he is harming himself, and yet it's so hard to get him to stop.
We've trained people for short-term values, for short-term results over and over. And I think that applies to the markets in 2008 and others, is nobody thinks long-term. If you skip your flu shot today, you're going to survive the flu, Dana. You'll be fine. You'll be sick for 5, 6, 7 days. But a decade from now, your rate of heart disease and cancer are 10 and 12% elevated. Yet nobody thinks about tomorrow, we only think about today. And we have to change that. We need to start to educate from the kids on up. You know, it's going to happen the next generation. We're done in terms of innovation. The innovation will happen at the young ages. You know, Kennedy said, we're going to put a man on the moon, and people thought he was crazy. The editorials were all negative. A decade later, Neil Armstrong stepped on the moon. The average age when Neil Armstrong stepped on the moon in missing command was 27, which means those kids were 18 years old when he made his proclamation. So we need to start to teach long-term metrics to our young kids.
Dr. Sebenius, I met Richard Branson, and I talked to him about the conflict, and he said, well, look, I'm sure, our conflict, of course, when we say conflict in Israel, it's only our conflict. I'm sure that if it was given or left to businessmen, they would solve it. And yet we have been, and we have with us President Peres, who has put his life in this effort, we are still almost to the point where even believers feel we're reaching a dead end. Is there such a big difference between businessmen and statesmen when it comes to solving negotiations? Reaching solutions, and negotiating.
I have both spent time in the U.S. government, the State Department. I've spent time on Wall Street. I've taught at the Kennedy School of Government and the Harvard Business School. And what I find is that the best negotiators, publicly and privately, share strong characteristics. And they are constantly focused on who they're dealing with, what's possible, what do people care about, what kind of solutions might there be. And frankly, some great negotiators come from the private sector, and some come from the public sector. The context is really different. But that sense, it's interesting, the advice that President Peres gave us applies so well in both domains, and particularly to the peacemaking problems. One of the most chilling things in Northern Ireland when George Mitchell was trying to solve the problem was a shout from a crowd, "To hell with the future, let's get on with the past." And in a sense, no, let's not do that. Let's see if we can find something that's not optimal, but better than no deal. And many times that'll lead you to success. And I think that great negotiators often learn from success as well as obsessing about failure. One of the things we've gotten from our great negotiators, both publicly and privately, is really a look at success following failure and then comparing the two. But if exclusive focus on one or the other doesn't get you from here to there. But I'm one of those people who feels you've got wisdom in both domains.
We just need the will. We just need the will.
Just need the will, and also the will yoked to enlightened approaches and techniques, right? You always want to say, what's the barrier? What makes this hard? And is it negotiating technique? Or in the case of the Israelis and Palestinians, can we not think of, is the nature of the deal the barrier? I don't think so. People have known for a while pretty much what it would look like, right? What is it? And many people say right now you have strong majorities on both sides who want peace, but who simply don't trust the other side does. And many Israelis say, you know, Palestinians don't want a two-state solution, they want a two-stage solution. First a deal, then push us in the sea. And there's similar sense among Palestinians that Israelis really just are happy to negotiate, but for time, while settlements inexorably expand. And if that's the case, much of what Dennis Ross said earlier in the conflict, that focusing on things each side can do to mitigate that suspicion, is much more likely to make formal negotiations more productive when you put them together.
Would you like to have the last sentence?
I know I agree with you completely, but I want to say one thing. People are occasionally unduly impatient. You need really a process. And if you fail, don't let your heart follow. Try again, and try again, and try again. I wish that the negotiations between us and the Palestinians would take 14 days instead of 14 years. But both of us are mistaken. They speak about Jews, we speak about Arabs. As though this is a simple proposition. If you'll take Jews and if you'll take Arabs, there are young Jews and old Jews. There are young Arabs and old Arabs. And believe me, the difference in age is even more meaning than the difference in nationality. There is a young generation that is revolting against the old one. Our children are telling us, thank you for giving us life, we appreciate it. But stop imposing upon us your experience. It was not so great as you claim.
Thank you, President Peres, and thank you, distinguished members of the panel. I truly, personally, and I'm sure I'm speaking on behalf of the audience, want to thank you for enlightening and inspiring Hikah for the day. Thank you so much, and we hope to see you here again next year in the convention. Thank you.